The gavel came down like thunder, but it was Judge Patricia Coleman's laughter that shattered 16-year-old Amara Thompson's world into a million pieces. Truancy, shoplifting, and now you're telling me you're some kind of scholar? Judge Coleman's voice dripped with disdain as she leaned back in her leather chair, her graying hair perfectly styled, her pale hands folded smugly across the bench. Young lady, do you think this court was born yesterday? Amara stood in the defendant's section wearing her only clean clothes. A faded purple hoodie with holes at the elbows and jeans that had seen better days 3 years ago. Her natural hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and dark circles shadowed her brown eyes. She clutched a worn manila folder against her chest like a shield, her knuckles ashy from the cold morning and stress. The courtroom was packed with the usual crowd, social workers shuffling papers, other kids waiting their turn, parents looking defeated or angry. But all eyes were on Amara now, and the weight of their stares felt like stones pressing down on her shoulders. Your Honor, if you would just look at my transcripts. Amara's voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. Transcripts. Judge Coleman cut her off, and that's when it happened. The laugh. Short, sharp, and cruel. Honey, I've been doing this for 25 years. I know exactly what kind of transcripts kids like you bring in here. The words kids like you hung in the air like smoke, choking everyone in the room. Amara felt her chest tighten, felt the familiar burn of tears she refused to let fall. Not here. Not in front of all these people who already thought they knew her story. Officer Barnes, the bailiff, shifted uncomfortably by the wall. Even he seemed surprised by the judge's tone. Mrs. Ruby Jackson, sitting in the gallery after spending her morning off from the community center to support Amara, closed her eyes and shook her head slowly. I don't think you understand, Amara said, her voice growing stronger. I haven't missed school because I don't care about education. I miss school because you'd rather steal candy bars and hang out on street corners, Judge Coleman interrupted, consulting her computer screen. Says here you were caught shoplifting food from a convenience store. And this isn't your first time in my courtroom for truancy. The prosecutor, a tired-looking woman with coffee stains on her blazer, cleared her throat. Your Honor, the defendant has been homeless for the past 4 months since her grandmother passed away. She was attempting to. I don't want to hear excuses, the judge snapped. Homeless or not, breaking the law is breaking the law. And sitting here claiming to be some kind of academic star when you can't even bother to show up to school consistently? That's just insulting to this court's intelligence. That's when something inside Amara broke wide open. Not broke like shattered glass, but broke like a dam that had been holding back a flood. She had spent 4 months sleeping in libraries and 24-hour laundromats, in the back stairwells of apartment buildings. She had showered in gas station bathrooms and done her homework by streetlight when the shelters were full. She had gone to bed hungry more nights than she had eaten dinner, and still, she had maintained perfect grades. You want to see my transcripts? Amara's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. You want to know who I really am? Judge Coleman's smirk faltered slightly, but her arrogance remained intact. By all means, enlighten us with your fairy tale. Amara opened the manila folder with hands that no longer shook. She pulled out a stack of papers, official documents with seals and signatures. But she didn't hand them forward yet. Instead, she looked directly at Judge Coleman, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every ancestor who had fought for her to be standing in that courtroom. My name is Amara Thompson. I'm 16 years old. 4 months ago, I lost the only family I had left when my grandmother died of cancer. I've been living on the streets since then because there's a waiting list for foster placement, and group homes don't have space. Her voice never wavered. I was caught shoplifting a loaf of bread, peanut butter, and milk because I hadn't eaten in 2 days and the food bank was closed. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her hands frozen above the keys. But what you really want to know, Amara continued, her dark eyes never leaving the judge's face, is who I am when I'm not standing in your courtroom being laughed at. She held up the first document. This is my acceptance letter to Howard University's early admission program. Full scholarship. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Coleman's face changed, the smirk disappearing entirely. Amara held up the second document. This is my letter from the National Merit Scholarship Program. I scored in the 99th percentile on the SAT. The murmur grew louder. Officer Barnes straightened up, his hand falling away from his radio. This, Amara continued, holding up a third document, is my research paper on systemic inequality in the juvenile justice system. It won first place in the state academic competition and is being published in the Journal of Youth Law. Judge Coleman's face had gone pale. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming. "And this," Amara said, holding up the final document with both hands, her voice growing stronger with each word, "is my high school transcript. 4.0 GPA. Class rank, number 1. I'm the valedictorian of Washington High School's graduating class." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Coleman stared at the documents, her mouth slightly open, her previous confidence crumbling like old paint. "The truancy charges you're referring to," Amara continued, "were from days when I was in the hospital with my grandmother during her final weeks of chemotherapy. The school district has already excused all those absences. The documentation is in your file if you had bothered to read it completely." Mrs. Jackson was crying openly now, tears of pride streaming down her weathered cheeks. Officer Barnes was shaking his head in what looked like disbelief and shame. "I don't come from money," Amara said, her voice filling every corner of the courtroom. "I don't have fancy clothes or a stable address. I don't have parents who can hire lawyers or make donations to judicial campaigns. What I have is my mind, my determination, and my refusal to let anyone, tell me that my circumstances define my worth." She placed the documents on the defense table and looked back at Judge Coleman, who seemed to have shrunk in her oversized chair. "So yes, Your Honor, I am exactly the kind of kid who ends up in your courtroom. I'm also exactly the kind of kid who will change the world despite everything the system has thrown at me. The question is, are you going to be part of the problem, or are you going to be part of my solution?" The courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs, but Amara kept her eyes fixed on the judge, waiting for an answer that would determine not just her immediate future, but her faith in justice itself. Judge Coleman's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the documents. For the first time in 25 years on the bench, she had been rendered completely speechless. And in that moment of silence, everything changed. Judge Patricia Coleman's hands shook as she lifted the first document, Howard University's letterhead crisp and official, the words "full scholarship" and "early admission" blazing up at her like accusations. The courtroom remained frozen in that terrible, beautiful silence that follows a truth so powerful it stops time itself. She had been so sure. So absolutely certain that she was looking at just another troubled kid making excuses, another sad story she'd heard 1,000 times before. In 25 years of family court, she had developed what she called radar, the ability to spot the real cases from the fabricated ones, the kids who needed help from the ones who were working the system. But as she read through Amara's research paper abstract, her throat grew tight. The writing was sophisticated, nuanced, brilliant. The kind of work she would expect from a graduate student, not a homeless 16-year-old standing before her in threadbare clothes. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said softly, breaking the spell, "how would you like to proceed?" Judge Coleman looked up to find every person in that courtroom staring at her. Amara stood perfectly still, her chin raised, waiting. There was no defiance in her posture now, no anger, just the quiet dignity of someone who had spoken their truth and was prepared to accept whatever came next. Mrs. Ruby Jackson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, whispering what looked like a prayer. Officer Barnes had moved closer to the bench, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. Even the other kids waiting for their cases had stopped their fidgeting and phone checking to watch this moment unfold. "Miss Thompson," Judge Coleman said, her voice cracking slightly. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Miss Thompson, please approach the bench." Amara walked forward with measured steps, her worn sneakers silent on the courtroom floor. When she reached the bench, she looked up at the judge with those steady dark eyes that had seen too much for someone her age. "These documents," Judge Coleman said quietly, holding up the papers. "They're all authentic?" "Yes, ma'am." "The research paper about juvenile justice inequality, you wrote this yourself?" "Yes, ma'am. I spent 6 months researching it while I was taking care of my grandmother. I interviewed 43 juveniles who had been through the system, analyzed sentencing disparities by race and socioeconomic status, and reviewed case files from 12 different jurisdictions." Judge Coleman felt something cold settle in her stomach. She thought of all the young black faces that had appeared before her bench over the years. How many times had she made assumptions? How many times had she failed to see past the surface? "The truancy charges," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "You said they were excused?" "The school district sent the documentation to the court 3 weeks ago, along with a letter from my teachers explaining my perfect attendance record aside from the medical absences. It should be in my file." Judge Coleman's law clerk, a young man who had been frantically searching through papers at his desk, suddenly stood up. "Your Honor, I found it. The excusal documentation. It was misfiled under a different case number." The weight of her mistake was crushing. Judge Coleman set the papers down carefully and looked at Amara, really looked at her, for the first time. She saw the way the girl carried herself despite her circumstances, the intelligence blazing in her eyes, the strength it must have taken to survive on the streets while maintaining perfect grades. "Miss Thompson," she said, "I owe you an apology." The courtroom stirred. Apologies from judges were rare, especially public ones. "The way I spoke to you was unacceptable. The assumptions I made were wrong, and they reflected poorly on this court and on me personally." Judge Coleman's voice grew stronger as she continued. "You are clearly an exceptional young woman who has overcome extraordinary challenges, and you deserved better from this system." Amara's composure finally cracked slightly, her eyes growing bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "But an apology isn't enough," Judge Coleman continued, turning to address the entire courtroom. "Officer Barnes, please dismiss the shoplifting charges. Given the circumstances and Ms. Thompson's exemplary character, this court finds that her actions were justified by necessity." Relief washed over Amara's face, but Judge Coleman wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I'm ordering the Department of Social Services to expedite emergency housing for Ms. Thompson. She should not spend another night on the streets." She looked directly at Amara again. "Young lady, I don't know how you managed to maintain your grades while living in such difficult conditions, but it speaks to a strength of character that humbles me." Mrs. Jackson was crying freely now, and several people in the gallery were wiping their eyes. Officer Barnes nodded approvingly, his earlier discomfort transformed into something like pride. "Your Honor," Amara said, her voice steady again, "may I say something?" "Of course. I wrote that research paper because I wanted to understand why so many kids who look like me end up in rooms like this, and why the system seems designed to fail us rather than help us. But I also wrote it because I believe things can change. People can change." She paused, meeting the judge's eyes. "Thank you for showing me that." Judge Coleman felt tears prick at her own eyes. In 25 years on the bench, she had never been so thoroughly challenged, so completely humbled, or so profoundly moved. "Miss Thompson, I want you to know that your research has given me a great deal to think about. And I hope you'll consider me an ally as you continue your academic journey." "I will, Your Honor." As Amara turned to leave, Judge Coleman called out one more time. "Miss Thompson? When you change the world, and I have no doubt that you will, remember that it started with never giving up on yourself even when others gave up on you." Amara smiled for the first time since entering the courtroom. It was a smile full of hope and possibility, bright enough to light up the entire room. "I won't forget, Your Honor. And thank you for not giving up on me either." As the courtroom began to empty, Judge Coleman sat alone at her bench, staring at the research paper in her hands. The title page read, "Beyond the Gavel, Examining Systemic Bias in Juvenile Justice and Pathways to Reform by Amara Thompson." She opened to the first page and began to read, knowing that this case, this remarkable young woman, had changed something fundamental in her understanding of justice, mercy, and the power of looking beyond first impressions. Outside the courtroom, Mrs. Jackson was already making phone calls, her network of community supporters mobilizing to ensure Amara would never have to sleep on the streets again. Officer Barnes was talking quietly with the social worker about expediting services. And Amara stood in the courthouse hallway, clutching her manila folder, looking out the tall windows at the city she was going to change, one truth at a time. Mrs. Ruby Jackson's phone was buzzing before she even made it to the courthouse parking lot. Word traveled fast in the community, and the story of what had just happened in Judge Coleman's courtroom was already spreading through the network of teachers, church members, and activists who had been quietly supporting Amara for months. "Ruby, is it true?" The voice belonged to Pastor Williams from Mount Olive Baptist Church. "Did that child really have a full scholarship to Howard?" "True as the day is long," Mrs. Jackson said, settling into her old Camry and adjusting her rearview mirror to watch Amara walking toward her. The girl moved with more confidence than she'd seen in months, her shoulders straighter, her step lighter. "And that judge got schooled in ways she won't forget." Amara slipped into the passenger seat, and Mrs. Jackson could see the exhaustion finally hitting her. The adrenaline of standing up for herself was wearing off, leaving behind the bone-deep weariness of a child who had been carrying adult burdens for far too long. "You hungry, baby?" Mrs. Jackson asked, though she already knew the answer. Amara was always hungry these days. "Yes, ma'am, but I can." "None of that. We're going to get you a real meal, and then we're going to figure out your housing situation before tonight." Mrs. Jackson pulled out of the parking lot, already mentally going through her list of contacts. "I've got 3 different families who've offered to take you in, and the emergency shelter coordinator owes me a favor." As they drove through the familiar neighborhoods of Southeast D.C., Amara pressed her face to the window. These streets held her childhood. The corner store where her grandmother used to buy her penny candy, the library where she'd spent countless afternoons, the high school where she'd somehow managed to maintain her perfect record despite everything falling apart at home. "Mrs. Jackson," Amara said quietly, "what if they change their minds about the scholarship? What if Howard finds out I'm homeless and decides I'm not suitable?" Mrs. Jackson pulled over and turned to face the girl who had become like a granddaughter to her over the past year. "Listen to me, child. You earned that scholarship with your brain and your hard work. Being homeless doesn't make you less worthy, it makes you more remarkable. You maintained a 4.0 GPA while living on the streets. Do you understand how extraordinary that is?" Tears welled up in Amara's eyes. "Some days I felt like I was going crazy. Trying to do calculus homework by streetlight, writing essays on my phone in McDonald's bathrooms, showing up to advanced placement classes in the same clothes 3 days in a row because I couldn't do laundry. But you did it anyway. I had to. My grandmother always said education was the one thing nobody could take away from me. Even when she was dying, she made me promise I wouldn't give up on school." Mrs. Jackson reached over and squeezed Amara's hand. "She would be so proud of you today. Watching you stand up in that courtroom, seeing you refuse to let that judge diminish you. Honey, that was your grandmother's spirit shining through you." They pulled up to Mama's Kitchen, a soul food restaurant that had been feeding the community for 40 years. The owner, Mrs. Betty, rushed out before they could even get to the door. "I heard what happened." Mrs. Betty wrapped Amara in a hug that smelled like cornbread and love. "Child, you come in here right now and let me feed you properly. And don't you even think about reaching for your wallet, Ruby Jackson. This meal is on the house." Inside the restaurant, word had already spread. Teachers from Amara's high school were sharing a table in the corner, raising their coffee cups in salute when she walked in. The librarian from the Central Branch, Miss Carmen, waved from the counter where she was picking up a to-go order. "Amara," called Principal Mitchell, who had somehow made it to the restaurant before them. "I've been trying to reach you all morning. We need to talk about graduation arrangements and scholarship ceremonies." As they settled into a booth, Mrs. Jackson watched the community rally around this child who had been invisible to the system but beloved by everyone who truly knew her. This was how it worked in their neighborhood. When the official channels failed, the unofficial ones stepped up. "Now," Mrs. Jackson said as Mrs. Betty brought over plates piled high with fried chicken, mac and cheese, and collard greens, "let's talk practical matters. Housing first, then we figure out everything else." Her phone rang again. This time it was Judge Coleman's clerk. "Mrs. Jackson? The judge asked me to call you. She's been in contact with several social service agencies, and there's been a breakthrough with emergency housing. Also, she wanted to know if Miss Thompson would be available to speak to a group of judges next month about juvenile justice reform." Mrs. Jackson looked at Amara, who was listening to every word while mechanically eating her first real meal in days. The girl nodded. "She'll be there," Mrs. Jackson said. "And thank the judge for me. Tell her the community appreciates her stepping up." As the afternoon wore on, the restaurant became an impromptu planning session. Principal Mitchell outlined the graduation timeline and mentioned that several news outlets wanted to interview Amara about her story. Ms. Carmen offered free library resources for any additional research projects. Pastor Williams stopped by to invite Amara to speak at the youth service about perseverance. "I don't want to be a poster child," Amara said quietly when there was finally a lull in the conversation. "I don't want people looking at me like I'm some kind of inspiration porn just because I did what I had to do to survive." Mrs. Jackson nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right attitude, baby. You get to decide how you want to tell your story and when. But remember, there are other kids out there right now going through what you went through. Some of them need to see that it's possible to make it through." "The research paper," Amara said slowly. "That's how I want to help. Not by being the exception but by changing the system so there don't have to be exceptions. So kids don't have to be extraordinary just to survive." Principal Mitchell leaned forward. "Speaking of your research, I've been in touch with Professor Davis at Howard School of Social Work. She's read your paper and wants to discuss expanding it into a larger study. Potentially something you could work on as an undergraduate researcher." For the first time in months, Amara's face lit up with genuine excitement. "Really? She thinks it has merit?" "Merit? Child, she thinks it could change policy. She's already shared it with colleagues at Georgetown Law and American University's Justice Policy Institute." As the sun began to set, Mrs. Jackson's network had worked its magic. Emergency housing was secured at a transitional facility specifically for aged-out foster youth and homeless students. Amara would have her own room, access to laundry facilities, and most importantly, a stable address for all her college paperwork. "One more thing," Mrs. Jackson said as they prepared to leave. "That judge, Judge Coleman? She called me personally to apologize and to ask if there was anything she could do to help. I told her the best thing she could do was remember this moment the next time a young person stands before her bench." "What did she say?" "She said she would never forget. And she meant it." As they drove toward Amara's new temporary home, the city lights beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness, Mrs. Jackson felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. Not just for Amara but for all the kids who had been written off, overlooked, or underestimated by systems that should have protected them. "You know what today taught me?" Amara said as they pulled up to the transitional housing facility. "What's that, baby?" "That sometimes the most important victories happen when you stop trying to be what people expect and start insisting on being exactly who you are." Mrs. Jackson smiled as they gathered Amara's few belongings from the back seat. "Your grandmother would have said that exact same thing." As they walked toward the building that would be Amara's first real home in 4 months, Mrs. Jackson whispered a prayer of gratitude for the community that had refused to let this remarkable child fall through the cracks, and for the moment of truth that had changed everything. 3 weeks after the courtroom confrontation, Judge Patricia Coleman sat in her chambers staring at a stack of case files that had taken on new meaning. Each manila folder represented a young life, and she found herself reading beyond the surface charges, looking for the stories beneath the statistics. The knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Officer Barnes entered, followed by a woman Judge Coleman didn't recognize, a tall, elegant black woman in her 50s wearing a crisp navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase. "Your Honor, this is Dr. Vanessa Hayes from the Urban Justice Institute," Officer Barnes said. "She wanted to speak with you about the Thompson case." Judge Coleman stood, extending her hand. "Dr. Hayes, please have a seat. I assume you're here about Amara's research." "Among other things," Dr. Hayes said, settling into the chair across from Judge Coleman's desk. "I've read her paper and I have to say, it's some of the most insightful analysis of juvenile justice bias I've encountered. But I'm also here because word of what happened in your courtroom has reached some very interested parties." "Oh." "The Department of Justice is conducting a review of sentencing disparities in juvenile courts across the region. Your willingness to acknowledge and correct bias in real time has caught their attention, in a good way. They're looking for judges who are committed to reform." Judge Coleman felt a flutter of nervousness. "I made a mistake, a serious one. I'm not sure that qualifies me as a reform leader." "On the contrary," Dr. Hayes said, pulling a tablet from her briefcase. "It's exactly what qualifies you. Most judges would have doubled down, found a way to save face. You chose justice over ego. That's rare." She showed Judge Coleman a series of charts and graphs. "These are statistics from your court over the past 5 years. Compared to other judges in this district, you actually have one of the better records for equitable sentencing. The Thompson case appears to be an aberration, not a pattern. That doesn't excuse it." "No, it doesn't. But it suggests that your bias was unconscious rather than systematic, and that makes it correctable." Dr. Hayes leaned forward. "We'd like you to consider participating in a pilot program, Unconscious Bias Training for Judges, developed in partnership with affected communities." Judge Coleman was quiet for a long moment. "Would Amara be involved?" "If she wants to be. I understand she started her freshman year at Howard." "Yes, with a full scholarship and early admission to their pre-law program." Judge Coleman couldn't keep the pride out of her voice. Over the past 3 weeks, she had found herself following Amara's progress like a proud relative, checking in with Mrs. Jackson and even attending Amara's high school graduation ceremony. "She's also been accepted into our Youth Policy Fellowship program," Dr. Hayes continued. "She'd work with us 1 day a week during the school year, expanding her research and presenting findings to judicial panels across the country." The idea of Amara training judges filled Judge Coleman with both admiration and appropriate humility. "She's going to change the system, isn't she?" "She already has. Your courtroom was just the beginning." After Dr. Hayes left, Judge Coleman found herself thinking about the ripple effects of that day. Amara's story had been picked up by local news, then national outlets. Howard University had featured her in their admissions materials as an example of overcoming adversity. The research paper had been cited in 3 different legal journals. But the changes closer to home were what mattered most. The court system had implemented new procedures for reviewing case files before hearings. Social services had streamlined their emergency housing process. And Judge Coleman herself had enrolled in additional training on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Jackson. Amara's first week at Howard went great. She wanted you to know she's thinking of minoring in criminal justice alongside her pre-law major. Says she wants to understand the system from all angles. Judge Coleman smiled, typing back, "Please tell her I'm proud of her. And that I hope she'll consider law school after Howard. We need more lawyers like her." The response came quickly. "She says to tell you she's already thinking about it. Law school, then maybe becoming a judge herself someday. Says the system needs people who remember what it feels like to be underestimated." The thought of Amara Thompson sitting behind a judge's bench in 10 or 15 years filled Judge Coleman with something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope for the future of justice itself. Later that afternoon, Judge Coleman found herself presiding over a case remarkably similar to Amara's. A young black woman, 17 years old, charged with truancy and minor theft. But this time, Judge Coleman took her time reviewing the file completely. She asked questions about the girl's living situation, her academic record, her family circumstances. The teenager, surprised by the judge's genuine interest, revealed that she had been caring for her disabled younger brother while their mother worked 2 jobs. The truancy was because she couldn't find reliable childcare. The theft was diapers and formula. Instead of lecturing or assuming the worst, Judge Coleman connected the family with social services, arranged for emergency childcare assistance, and dismissed the charges with the requirement that the teenager check in monthly with a court counselor to ensure she was getting the support she needed. As the girl left the courtroom with tears of relief in her eyes, Judge Coleman thought about Amara's words. "The question is, are you going to be part of the problem, or are you going to be part of my solution?" She was choosing to be part of the solution, one case at a time. That evening, Judge Coleman attended a community meeting at Mount Olive Baptist Church, where she had been invited to speak about juvenile justice reform. The church was packed, and she saw many familiar faces: Mrs. Jackson, Principal Mitchell, several teachers from Washington High School. But the person she was most nervous to see was in the front row. Amara Thompson, home from her first week at Howard University, wearing a Howard sweatshirt and looking every inch the confident young scholar she had always been beneath the circumstances. "When I first met Amara Thompson," Judge Coleman began, her voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary, "I made every assumption it was possible to make. I saw her clothes, her circumstances, and I thought I knew her story. I was not just wrong, I was dangerously wrong." She spoke for 20 minutes about bias, about the responsibility of those in power to look deeper, about the young woman who had educated a judge in the most important lesson of her career. When she finished, the applause was sustained and genuine. But it was Amara who stood up first, clapping with tears streaming down her face. After the meeting, Amara approached the front of the sanctuary where Judge Coleman was packing up her notes. "Judge Coleman," she said, "I wanted to thank you." "You wanted to thank me? I think I have that backwards." "No," Amara said firmly. "You could have gotten defensive that day. You could have found a way to punish me for embarrassing you in front of a full courtroom. Instead, you chose to listen, to learn, and to change. That takes courage." Judge Coleman felt tears pricking her eyes. "You gave me no choice but to confront my own bias. That was a gift, even if it was a difficult one to receive. Mrs. Jackson says you've been following my progress at Howard. I hope that's okay. I feel invested in your success." Amara smiled, that brilliant smile that had lit up the courtroom 3 weeks ago. "More than okay. I wanted to tell you about my first assignment in constitutional law. I'm writing a paper on the intersection of unconscious bias and due process rights." "That sounds like powerful research." "It is. And I wanted you to know, when I become a lawyer and maybe someday a judge, I'm going to remember the day a judge chose justice over pride. That's the kind of judge I want to be." As they shook hands, Judge Coleman realized that Amara Thompson hadn't just changed her courtroom that day, she had changed the trajectory of justice itself, creating a ripple effect that would continue long after they were both gone. The girl who had been underestimated by everyone was now teaching a master class in hope, resilience, and the power of refusing to be defined by other people's limitations. And Judge Coleman knew she would spend the rest of her career trying to be worthy of the lessons she had been given. Dr. Vanessa Hayes stood at the podium in Howard University's Crampon Auditorium, looking out at an audience of law students, professors, and community advocates. But her eyes kept drifting to the young woman sitting in the third row, taking notes with the focused intensity that had already made her a standout in her first semester. "Today we're discussing the implementation of unconscious bias training in judicial systems," Dr. Hayes began. And we're fortunate to have with us the architect of groundbreaking research in this area, Howard freshman and Urban Justice Institute fellow, Amara Thompson. The applause was warm and sustained as Amara made her way to the podium. At 17, she carried herself with a poise that belied her age, wearing a navy blazer over dark jeans and speaking with the confidence of someone who had already faced down her worst fears. 6 months ago, Amara began, I stood in a courtroom and listened to a judge laugh at my dreams. Today, I'm here to talk about how that moment of injustice became a catalyst for systematic change. She clicked to her first slide, a graph showing sentencing disparities in juvenile courts across the D.C. metropolitan area. The research I began as a homeless high school student has now expanded into a comprehensive analysis of bias in judicial decision-making, funded by the Urban Justice Institute and supported by a coalition of civil rights organizations. In the audience, Professor Michelle Carter from Howard's Law School leaned forward. She had been following Amara's work closely, already discussing the possibility of the young woman entering a joint JD/PhD program that would allow her to continue her research while earning her law degree. But data alone doesn't change systems, Amara continued. Change happens when individuals choose to confront their own biases and commit to doing better. That's why the judicial training program we've developed focuses not just on statistics, but on personal stories and real accountability. She clicked to the next slide, showing photographs from training sessions. In the past 3 months, we've trained over 150 judges across 5 states. The results are measurable. Sentencing disparities have decreased by an average of 23% in participating courts. The audience murmured approvingly, but Amara wasn't finished. However, the most important change isn't in the numbers, it's in the stories. Stories like Judge Patricia Coleman, who had the courage to acknowledge her mistake publicly and become an advocate for reform. Stories like the 17-year-old girl in Baltimore whose charges were dismissed last month because a trained judge took the time to understand her circumstances instead of making assumptions. After the presentation, Amara was surrounded by professors and students eager to discuss her research. But she noticed one familiar figure standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, Mrs. Ruby Jackson, who had driven up from D.C. to hear her speak. Mrs. Jackson. Amara broke away from the group and embraced the woman who had become her chosen family. I didn't know you were coming. Wouldn't miss it, baby. Your grandmother would have been so proud to see you up there, teaching college professors and law students. They found a quiet corner of the auditorium to talk. Mrs. Jackson pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages. I've got news from the community, she said. Remember that transitional housing program you stayed in? They've received a major grant to expand, partly because your story helped illustrate the need. They're naming one of the study rooms after you. Amara felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the emotion that came whenever she realized how far she'd traveled from those desperate months on the streets. I don't need my name on anything, Mrs. Jackson. I just want other kids to have what I almost lost, hope. I know, child. But sometimes being visible helps other people find their own courage to speak up. They were interrupted by Professor Carter, who approached with an apologetic smile. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Amara, I wanted to discuss something with you. The admissions committee at Harvard Law School has reached out. They're very interested in your research and want to discuss early admission possibilities. Amara's eyes widened. Harvard Law. Your work is getting attention at the highest levels of legal academia. But, Professor Carter continued, we'd love to keep you here at Howard for law school too. Your research aligns perfectly with our civil rights focus. After Professor Carter left, Mrs. Jackson studied Amara's face. That's a big decision, baby. It is. But honestly, Mrs. Jackson, I think I need to stay close to home. The communities that supported me when I had nothing, they're where the real work needs to happen. Harvard's prestige won't help the next kid standing in Judge Coleman's courtroom if I'm not connected to the people who understand the struggle. Mrs. Jackson nodded approvingly. Your grandmother always said true education means coming back to lift others up. Speaking of Judge Coleman, Amara said, she invited me to observe her court next week. She's implementing some new procedures based on our recommendations, and she wants my input on how they're working. The thought of returning to that courtroom, not as a defendant but as a consultant, still felt surreal. But Amara had learned that growth often happened in the spaces that once seemed impossible to navigate. Later that evening, Amara sat in her dorm room video chatting with a group of high school students from across the country who had read about her story and wanted advice on overcoming educational barriers. The most important thing to remember, she told them, is that your circumstances don't define your potential. But you have to be willing to work twice as hard and speak twice as loud to make people see past their assumptions. One of the students, a 15-year-old girl from Detroit, asked, "What do you do when teachers don't believe in you?" "You believe in yourself so fiercely that it becomes contagious," Amara replied. "And you document everything, your grades, your achievements, your goals. Make them see the evidence even when they don't want to." After the call ended, Amara opened her laptop to work on her latest research project. A longitudinal study tracking outcomes for youth who had been through bias training judicial processes versus traditional court proceedings. The work was demanding, requiring her to balance her full course load at Howard with research responsibilities and speaking engagements. But as she typed her analysis of the latest data, Amara thought about the girl from Detroit, about all the young people who were fighting to be seen and heard in systems that weren't designed for their success. Her phone buzzed with a text from Judge Coleman. "Excited to see you next week. The new procedures are working well, and I've had 3 other judges ask about implementing similar changes. Your research is changing lives, Amara." Amara smiled as she typed back, "Our research, Judge Coleman. This is a team effort." The response came quickly, "You're right. But you're the one who had the courage to demand better." That made all the difference. As Amara returned to her laptop, the cursor blinking on a screen full of data and analysis, she thought about the journey from that desperate morning in the courtroom to this moment of purpose and possibility. She wasn't the same scared, homeless girl who had clutched a manila folder like armor. She had become something more powerful, a young woman who had transformed her pain into purpose and her struggle into strength. The research was just the beginning. The real work of changing hearts, minds, and systems was still ahead of her. But for the first time since her grandmother's death, Amara felt ready for whatever came next. The courthouse looked exactly the same from the outside, but everything felt different as Amara walked up the stone steps 6 months after her first appearance before Judge Coleman. This time she carried a professional leather portfolio instead of a manila folder, wore a tailored suit purchased with her fellowship stipend, and walked beside Dr. Hayes rather than alone. "Nervous?" Dr. Hayes asked as they passed through security. "A little," Amara admitted. "It's strange being back here as an observer rather than a defendant." Inside courtroom 4A, Judge Coleman was already reviewing files for the morning session. When she saw Amara enter, her face lit up with genuine warmth. "Miss Thompson," she said during a brief recess, approaching the gallery where Amara sat. "Thank you for coming. I'm eager to get your perspective on how the new procedures are working." Over the past month, Judge Coleman's court had implemented several changes based on Amara's research. Mandatory file review periods before hearings, standardized questions about defendant circumstances, and regular bias check-ins where judges paused to examine their initial assumptions. As the morning session began, Amara watched case after case unfold differently than they would have just months before. A 14-year-old boy charged with skipping school was asked about his home situation before being lectured about responsibility. When he revealed he'd been missing classes to work at his uncle's bodega to help support his family, Judge Coleman connected him with social services and adjusted his probation requirements to accommodate his work schedule. A 16-year-old girl caught shoplifting makeup wasn't immediately assumed to be vain or criminal. Judge Coleman's probing questions revealed that the girl was living with relatives who couldn't afford basic necessities, and the makeup was for job interviews. Instead of punishment, she received job placement assistance and had her charges dismissed contingent on completing a life skills program. "It's working," Amara whispered to Dr. Hayes during a brief recess. "She's actually seeing them as individuals." The most powerful moment came when a young man Amara's age, 17, black, wearing clothes that had clearly seen better days, was brought before the bench for repeat truancy charges. 6 months ago, Judge Coleman would have launched into a lecture about responsibility and consequences. Today she took her time reviewing his file, asked about his living situation, his family circumstances, his academic interests. The young man, clearly surprised by the genuine attention, revealed that he'd been bouncing between relatives since his mother's incarceration, that he loved science but was struggling to keep up with advanced classes while dealing with housing instability. "What do you want to study in college?" Judge Coleman asked. The question clearly caught him off guard. "Engineering, maybe. But I don't think college is really an option for someone like me." "Someone like you?" Judge Coleman's voice was gentle but firm. "You mean someone intelligent enough to maintain passing grades while facing housing insecurity? Someone strong enough to keep showing up despite incredible challenges? Mr. Washington, I think college is exactly where someone like you belongs." Amara watched the young man's posture change, his shoulders straightening as Judge Coleman connected him with educational resources and modified his probation to include tutoring support rather than just punitive requirements. After the session ended, Judge Coleman invited Amara to her chambers. "Your research has fundamentally changed how I approach every case," she said, settling behind her desk. "But more than that, it's changed how I see my role. I'm not just here to dispense punishment. I'm here to dispense justice, and sometimes that means seeing potential where others see problems." "The changes are incredible," Amara said. "That young man, Mr. Washington, 6 months ago, his story might have ended very differently." "Speaking of which," Judge Coleman said, pulling out a letter from her desk drawer, "I received this yesterday. It's from a juvenile court judge in Atlanta who attended one of our training sessions. She wanted you to know that your research helped her recognize bias in her own decision-making, and she's implementing similar changes in her courtroom." Amara read the letter, feeling that familiar surge of purpose. "This is what I hoped for when I started the research. Systematic change, not just individual cases." "There's something else," Judge Coleman continued. "The National Association of Juvenile Court Judges has asked me to present your research at their national conference next month. They want you to co-present with me. You want me to speak to a room full of judges? I think they need to hear from you directly. Your voice, your perspective, your research, it carries weight that my endorsement alone can't provide." Over lunch at a small cafe near the courthouse, Amara and Dr. Hayes discussed the expanding scope of her research. What had started as a high school paper had grown into a multi-state study with policy implications at the federal level. "The Department of Justice wants to pilot your bias training program in 10 major metropolitan areas," Dr. Hayes explained. "If the results match what we're seeing here in D.C., it could become standard training for all federal judicial appointments." Amara almost choked on her sandwich. "Federal appointments? Your research is being taken very seriously at the highest levels, Amara. The question is, are you ready for that level of visibility and responsibility?" That evening, Amara called Mrs. Jackson to debrief about the day and the overwhelming news about the federal pilot program. "Child, I remember when you were doing that research at the kitchen table in the community center, surrounded by law books and legal papers," Mrs. Jackson said. "You said you wanted to understand why the system seemed designed to fail kids like you. Now you're redesigning the system itself." "It doesn't feel real sometimes," Amara admitted. 6 months ago I was homeless. Now federal agencies want to implement my recommendations nationwide. That's because you never stopped believing in the power of education and truth to change things. Your grandmother always said you were going to do something special with your life. I just want to make sure I stay connected to where I came from, Mrs. Jackson. All this attention and opportunity, it's amazing, but the kids who are in the system right now, they're what matters. That's exactly why you're the right person for this work, baby. You understand that real change happens one courtroom, one judge, one young person at a time." After hanging up, Amara sat at her desk in her Howard dorm room, working on her presentation for the National Judicial Conference. She thought about all the young people who would stand in courtrooms across the country in the coming months, facing judges who might, because of her research, take a moment to see past assumptions and look for the person beneath the circumstances. The thought was both humbling and energizing. Her own moment of crisis in Judge Coleman's courtroom had become a catalyst for changing how justice was administered to thousands of youth across the nation. As she typed her presentation notes, Amara reflected on how far she'd traveled from that desperate morning when she'd clutched her manila folder and demanded to be seen. Now she was helping ensure that other young people wouldn't have to fight so hard just to be heard. The girl who had been underestimated was now training the people in power to estimate more carefully, more fairly, more justly. And this was still just the beginning. The Marriott Grand Ballroom in Chicago was filled with nearly 800 juvenile court judges from across the United States, and Amara Thompson stood backstage feeling the weight of their collective attention. At 18 years old, she was about to address the most powerful assembly of juvenile justice professionals in the country. "You ready for this?" Judge Coleman asked, adjusting her presentation slides on the laptop they'd be sharing. "I think so," Amara said, though her heart was racing. "It's just, these people make decisions that affect thousands of kids every day. What if I can't make them understand?" "Amara," Judge Coleman placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, 6 months ago, you made me understand in a way that changed everything. Trust your voice. Trust your research. These judges need to hear what you have to say." Dr. Hayes appeared beside them with a smile. "The advance buzz has been incredible. 3 different legal journals want to interview you after your presentation, and there are representatives here from courts in 27 states specifically to hear your research." As they were introduced, Amara walked out onto the stage to sustained applause. But what struck her wasn't the sound, it was the sea of faces, mostly older, mostly white, all looking at her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism that she recognized from that first day in Judge Coleman's courtroom. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "My name is Amara Thompson. 18 months ago, I was a homeless teenager standing in a courtroom, being laughed at by a judge who thought she knew my story before I could tell it. Today, I'm here to talk about how that moment of bias nearly derailed a future that included a full scholarship to Howard University and research that's being implemented in courts across the nation." The room went completely silent. She had their attention. "But I'm not here to shame anyone or to claim moral superiority. I'm here because the research I've conducted over the past year proves that bias in judicial decision-making isn't just an abstract problem. It's a measurable phenomenon with concrete solutions." She clicked to her first slide, showing comparative sentencing data across demographic lines. These numbers represent real young people whose futures were determined in part by unconscious bias. Black and Latino youth receive sentences 25% longer than white youth for identical crimes. They are 40% more likely to be tried as adults. They are 60% less likely to receive alternative sentencing options like community service or counseling. A murmur went through the audience. Some judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "But here's what gives me hope," Amara continued, clicking to the next slide. "Courts that have implemented bias recognition training show dramatic improvements in sentencing equity within 6 months. The training isn't about political correctness or walking on eggshells. It's about making better decisions based on complete information rather than incomplete assumptions." She told the story of her own case, of Judge Coleman's initial reaction and subsequent transformation. She showed video testimonials from other young people whose cases had been handled differently after their judges received bias training. "The most powerful tool we have," Amara said, approaching the end of her presentation, "is the willingness to pause. To ask ourselves, what am I assuming about this young person based on their appearance, their circumstances, their zip code? And then to set those assumptions aside and look at the individual standing before us." She clicked to her final slide, a photograph of the young man Judge Coleman had encouraged to pursue engineering 6 months earlier. He was wearing a Howard University t-shirt. "This is Marcus Washington. 6 months ago he was facing potential placement in juvenile detention for chronic truancy. Today he's a freshman at Howard University studying mechanical engineering, accepted with a scholarship based on his academic potential that almost got buried under assumptions about his character." The applause was thunderous and sustained. Amara saw judges throughout the auditorium wiping their eyes, nodding in recognition, and many were already taking notes about implementing similar training in their own courts. During the Q&A session, the questions were thoughtful and engaged. A judge from Texas asked about adapting the training for rural courts with different demographic challenges. A judge from California wanted to know about measuring long-term outcomes for youth who went through reformed judicial processes. But the question that stopped Amara in her tracks came from an older black woman in the third row who identified herself as Judge Martha Franklin from Detroit. "Ms. Thompson, your research is groundbreaking, but I want to ask you about something else. You mentioned being homeless while maintaining perfect grades. How many other young people like you are out there right now, struggling to survive while trying to excel academically? What are we missing when we don't look beyond the surface?" The auditorium fell silent again. This question went beyond bias training to the fundamental question of how many potential scholars, leaders, and innovators were being overlooked because their circumstances masked their capabilities. "Judge Franklin," Amara said, her voice growing stronger, "I believe there are thousands of young people just in this country who are performing academic miracles in impossible circumstances. Kids doing calculus homework in shelters, writing college essays on phones in library bathrooms, maintaining GPAs while raising younger siblings or caring for sick relatives." She paused, looking out at the sea of judges. "The tragedy isn't just that we're biased against them when they come before our courts. The tragedy is that we're missing opportunities to recognize and nurture extraordinary potential. How many future doctors, lawyers, engineers, and maybe judges are we losing because we can't see past their zip codes and circumstances?" The silence that followed was profound. Then Judge Franklin stood up and began applauding, followed quickly by the entire auditorium in what became a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. After the presentation, Amara was surrounded by judges wanting to implement her training programs in their jurisdictions. But the conversation that meant the most came from Judge Franklin, who pulled her aside during the lunch break. "Child, I've been on the bench for 30 years, and I've never heard anyone articulate the connection between survival and excellence the way you just did. I want you to know that I'm going back to Detroit and implementing everything you've recommended. But more than that, I'm going to start looking for the Amara Thompsons in my courtroom, the kids whose brilliance is hidden under their circumstances." That evening at the conference dinner, Amara was presented with the association's first ever Youth Advocacy Award for her research contributions. As she stood at the podium holding the Crystal Award, she thought about all the young people who would benefit from the conversations her research had started. "This award doesn't belong to me alone," she said. "It belongs to every young person who has ever stood in a courtroom hoping someone would see their potential instead of just their problems. It belongs to the judges who have the courage to examine their own biases and commit to doing better. And it belongs to the communities that refuse to give up on their children, even when the system does." Later that night, Amara video called Mrs. Jackson from her hotel room, exhausted but exhilarated. "Baby, I watched the live stream of your presentation," Mrs. Jackson said, beaming with pride. "You had those judges eating out of your hand. But more importantly, you spoke truth with such power and grace. Mrs. Jackson, I keep thinking about what Judge Franklin said, how many other kids like me are out there right now? Kids who could change the world if someone just gave them a chance to show who they really are. That's why this work matters so much, honey. You're not just changing the system for yourself. You're opening doors for all the children who come after you." As Amara prepared for bed that night, she reflected on how her research had evolved from a desperate attempt to save her own future into a national movement for judicial reform. The scared teenager who had stood in Judge Coleman's courtroom 18 months ago had become a voice for systematic change. But she knew the real work was just beginning. Changing policies was one thing, changing hearts and minds was another. Tomorrow she would return to Howard University for her spring semester, but she would carry with her the commitment of 800 judges to see more clearly, decide more fairly, and remember that behind every case file was a young person whose entire future could be shaped by a moment of bias or a moment of justice. Spring semester at Howard was in full swing when Amara received an unexpected phone call that would change the trajectory of her advocacy work. She was in the library, deep in research for her constitutional law class, when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. "Is this Amara Thompson?" The voice was crisp, professional, with a slight southern accent. "Yes, this is Amara. Miss Thompson, this is Chief Justice Rebecca Morrison from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. I attended your presentation at the Juvenile Court Judges Conference last month, and I'd like to discuss an opportunity with you." Amara nearly dropped her phone. Chief Justice Morrison was one of the most respected federal judges in the country, and had been mentioned as a potential Supreme Court nominee. "Yes, ma'am. I'm honored to hear from you. I'm calling because I've been following your research on unconscious bias in judicial decision-making, and I believe it has applications beyond juvenile courts. I'd like to invite you to participate in a federal judicial education seminar this summer. We're looking at implementing bias recognition training for federal judges across all circuits." Amara's mind was racing. "You want me to present to federal judges? I want you to help design curriculum that will be used to train every federal judge in the United States. Your research methodology is sound, your recommendations are practical, and your voice carries authenticity that academic researchers alone cannot provide." After the call ended, Amara sat in stunned silence in the library stacks. What had started as a high school research paper written by a homeless teenager was now being considered for implementation at the highest levels of the federal judiciary. She immediately called Dr. Hayes, who was equally shocked by the invitation. "Amara, do you understand what this means? If federal courts adopt your training protocols, it could influence hundreds of thousands of cases every year. This isn't just juvenile justice anymore, this is the entire federal system." The weight of that responsibility was both thrilling and terrifying. That evening, Amara called Mrs. Jackson to talk through her feelings about the expanding scope of her work. "I'm scared I'm in over my head," she admitted. "These are some of the most powerful judges in the country and I'm still just a college freshman." "Baby, let me tell you something," Mrs. Jackson said firmly. "Age doesn't determine wisdom, and credentials don't determine truth. You have something those judges need, lived experience combined with rigorous research. Don't let anyone convince you that you're not qualified to be in those rooms." The following week brought another surprise. Amara was walking across Howard's campus when a familiar figure approached her. Marcus Washington, the young man from Judge Coleman's courtroom whose story she had shared at the national conference. "Amara," he called out, jogging to catch up with her. "I've been looking for you." "Marcus, how are you doing?" How's engineering school treating you? That's what I wanted to talk to you about, he said, his eyes bright with excitement. I've been thinking about what you said at that conference, about how many kids like us are out there, struggling and being overlooked. I want to help with your research. They found a quiet spot on the quad where Marcus explained his idea. I've been connecting with other students who had similar experiences, kids who overcame homelessness, poverty, family problems, involvement with the justice system. We all have stories about times when the system almost failed us, and times when someone saw our potential instead of our problems. What are you proposing? A student advisory board for your research. Kids who've been through the system, who can help you understand the youth perspective and maybe help train judges to see us differently. The idea was brilliant. Amara had been focused on training judges to recognize bias, but she hadn't considered the power of having young people directly involved in that training process. Marcus, I think you might have just revolutionized our approach. Over the next month, they assembled a diverse group of Howard students who had been through various aspects of the juvenile justice system. There was Jasmine, who had been in foster care and faced charges for defending herself against an abusive guardian. David, who had been arrested for selling drugs to help support his family after his father was deported. Christina, who had been labeled a chronic runaway when she was actually escaping domestic violence. Each had stories of judges who had made assumptions, and each had eventually encountered someone in the system who had taken the time to see their full humanity. This is powerful, Dr. Hayes said when Amara presented the student advisory board concept. Having young people directly involved in judicial training creates accountability in a way that academic presentations alone cannot achieve. The pilot program launched in May with a training session for judges in the D.C. metropolitan area. The format was revolutionary. Instead of traditional lectures about bias, judges heard directly from young people who had been affected by judicial decisions, both negative and positive. Jasmine told the story of the judge who had automatically assumed she was lying about abuse because she had been in multiple foster placements. Then she talked about the judge who had taken the time to read her case file completely and connected her with appropriate services. David explained how being seen as just another drug dealer had nearly derailed his academic trajectory, and how one judge's decision to look at his family circumstances had changed everything. The judges were visibly moved. Several approached the students afterward to apologize for their own past assumptions and to ask for guidance on making better decisions. Judge Coleman, who had been observing the training, was emotional as she spoke with Amara afterward. "This is extraordinary," she said. "Having these young people tell their stories directly, it's impossible to maintain distance or denial. Every judge in that room will think twice before making assumptions about the next young person who stands before their bench." The success of the pilot program caught the attention of Chief Justice Morrison, who called Amara personally to discuss expanding the model nationally. "Ms. Thompson, I've reviewed the feedback from your pilot program, and the results are remarkable. 97% of participating judges reported that the training would influence their future decision-making. More importantly, they're asking for follow-up sessions." "The students made the difference," Amara said. "When judges can see the human impact of their decisions, when they understand that their assumptions can derail or redirect entire futures, it becomes personal in a way that statistics alone cannot achieve." "I agree completely. I'd like to propose something ambitious, a national rollout of this program over the next 2 years, targeting every federal judicial district in the country. Are you and your team prepared for that level of expansion?" Amara looked across her dorm room at the wall where But the moment that meant the most came during the final training session of the semester, when a federal judge approached Marcus after his presentation. "Young man," the judge said, "I want to apologize to you and to every young person I may have underestimated over my 20 years on the bench. But more than that, I want to thank you for helping me become a better judge." Marcus smiled, the same kind of transformative smile that Amara had given Judge Coleman that first day in court. "That's exactly why we do this work," he said. "Not to make you feel guilty about the past, but to help you make better decisions for the kids who are coming before you tomorrow." As Amara packed up her materials that day, she realized that her greatest achievement wasn't the research or the awards or the national recognition. It was the community of young people who had found their voices through her work, and who were now helping to ensure that other youth would be seen, heard, and valued by the justice system. The scared teenager clutching a manila folder had become a catalyst for a movement that was changing the lives of young people across the nation. And they were just getting started. 2 years after that first devastating encounter in Judge Coleman's courtroom, Amara Thompson stood in the marble hallway outside the Supreme Court of the United States, holding a briefcase that contained her research findings on unconscious bias in the federal judiciary. At 19, she was the youngest person ever to serve as a consultant on judicial education for the nation's highest court. The morning's oral arguments had just concluded in a landmark case about juvenile sentencing, and Chief Justice Morrison had asked Amara to observe the proceedings and provide recommendations on how bias training might improve future decisions in similar cases. "Are you nervous?" asked Professor Elena Rodriguez from Georgetown Law, who had become Amara's mentor as her research expanded beyond Howard's undergraduate program. "Honestly? Yes," Amara admitted, adjusting her navy suit jacket. 2 years ago, I was fighting just to be heard in a single courtroom. Now I'm advising the Supreme Court on how to train federal judges across the entire country. Dr. Hayes appeared beside them, having just finished a meeting with several justices' law clerks about implementing the bias training curriculum nationally. "The justices were incredibly receptive to your recommendations," she reported. Justice Chin specifically asked about expanding the youth advisory component to include former defendants in federal cases. As they walked toward the exit, Amara's phone buzzed with a call from Mrs. Jackson. "Baby, I just saw the news coverage of your Supreme Court testimony." Mrs. Jackson's voice was filled with pride. "The reporter said you spoke with the kind of authority usually reserved for seasoned legal scholars." "It still feels surreal," Amara confessed. "Sometimes I look around these marble halls and remember sleeping in subway stations just 3 years ago." "That's exactly why you belong there, honey. You understand justice from both sides, as someone who needed it and as someone who studies how to make it work better." That afternoon, Amara returned to her apartment near Howard's campus to find an unexpected visitor waiting outside her building. Marcus Washington stood there holding flowers and wearing a huge grin. "Congratulations, Supreme Court consultant," he said, embracing her warmly. "I couldn't let this day pass without celebrating properly." "Marcus, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did. Do you realize what you've accomplished? Your research is now official curriculum for every federal judge in the United States. The kid who was almost derailed by one judge's bias is now training all the judges." They walked to their favorite coffee shop near campus, where Marcus had news of his own to share. "I've been accepted to Howard Law School for next year. Full scholarship, and I want to focus on juvenile justice reform." "Marcus, that's incredible. We'll be able to continue working together." "That's the plan. I've been thinking about what you said in your Supreme Court presentation about creating a pipeline of lawyers who understand the system from the inside. Kids like us who've been through it and come out determined to fix it." Over coffee, they discussed the evolution of their youth advisory program, which now included former defendants from 12 federal districts who regularly participated in judicial training sessions. The impact had been measurable. Courts with trained judges showed 35% fewer sentencing disparities and 50% better outcomes for youth defendants. "The most powerful moment in today's training session," Marcus shared, "was when this federal judge from Montana broke down crying after hearing Jasmine's story about being tried as an adult at 15. He said he'd sentenced dozens of kids her age without ever considering their individual circumstances." As the evening wound down, Amara walked home through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, passing the community center where Mrs. Jackson still volunteered, the high school where she had somehow managed to graduate valedictorian despite being homeless, and the courthouse where her journey had begun. Her phone rang again. This time it was Judge Coleman. "Amara, I wanted to call you personally to congratulate you on your Supreme Court presentation. I watched the live stream and I've never been prouder of someone I've had the privilege to know." "Thank you, Judge Coleman. None of this would have happened without that first conversation in your courtroom. Actually, I think it would have happened eventually. Your determination and brilliance would have found a way to shine through. I'm just grateful that I was smart enough to listen when you demanded to be heard." There was a pause before Judge Coleman continued. "I have some news to share with you. I've been offered a position on the Court of Appeals, and I've decided to accept it. Partly because I want to expand the impact of the work we've started together." "Congratulations. That's wonderful news. There's something else. I want you to consider applying for law school a year early. With your research credentials and practical experience, you could easily handle the academic work. And the legal community needs voices like yours in leadership positions." That night, Amara sat at her desk working on the final chapter of the book she was writing about her research, a comprehensive guide to implementing bias training in judicial systems. But Judge Coleman's suggestion kept echoing in her mind. Early admission to law school would mean finishing her undergraduate degree in 3 years instead of 4. It would accelerate her timeline for becoming a lawyer, potentially a judge herself someday. But it would also mean leaving behind some of the undergraduate experience she had fought so hard to earn. She called the person whose opinion mattered most to her. Mrs. Jackson, if I finish college early to start law school, do you think I'd be rushing into something I'm not ready for? Child, I think you've been ready for law school since you were 16 years old, standing in that courtroom explaining constitutional law to a judge who had underestimated you. The question isn't whether you're ready, the question is whether you're ready to take on even more responsibility for changing the system. I am, Amara said without hesitation. Every day I wait is another day that kids like me are facing biased judges who haven't been trained to see past their assumptions. If I can become a lawyer faster, I can help more people sooner. Then you have your answer, baby. The next morning, Amara called Professor Rodriguez to discuss early admission possibilities. Within a week, she had applications to 5 top law schools, each accompanied by letters of recommendation from Chief Justice Morrison, Dr. Hayes, and Judge Coleman. But more importantly, her applications included a personal statement that began, 3 years ago, I was a homeless teenager standing in a courtroom, being laughed at by a judge who thought my dreams were impossible. Today, I've trained over 2,000 federal judges on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. I want to become a lawyer not because the system has been kind to me, but because I understand how powerful it can be when it works correctly, and how devastating it can be when it fails. As Amara sealed the last application envelope, she thought about the girl who had clutched a manila folder in Judge Coleman's courtroom, demanding to be seen and heard. That girl had become a young woman who was reshaping the justice system itself. But the most important transformation wasn't in the policies or procedures or training programs she had created. It was in the hundreds of young people who had found their voices through her work, who now stood confidently before judges who had been trained to listen. The revolution she had started with a single moment of courage had become a movement that would outlive her, carried forward by every kid who refused to be defined by other people's assumptions and every judge who chose to see potential instead of problems. And this was still only the beginning of what was possible when justice became personal, when bias became conscious, and when the most unlikely voices demanded to be heard. 5 years after the moment that changed everything, Amara Thompson walked into courtroom 4A as an attorney for the first time. At 23, she had just graduated from Harvard Law School summa cum laude and was now working as a staff attorney for the Urban Justice Institute, representing youth in the same courthouse where her own journey had begun. Judge Coleman, now serving on the U.S. Court of Appeals but back as a visiting judge for this special session, looked up from her bench with undisguised pride as Amara approached the counsel table. "Good morning, Your Honor," Amara said, her voice strong and confident. Attorney Amara Thompson representing the defendant. The irony was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. Mrs. Jackson sat in the gallery, dabbing at her eyes with tissues. Dr. Hayes was present as an observer, documenting this full-circle moment for the case study she was writing about Amara's impact on judicial reform. Marcus Washington, now a second-year law student and Amara's research partner, sat beside Mrs. Jackson with a barely contained grin. But the most important person in the room was the 16-year-old girl sitting at the defendant's table. Destiny Rodriguez, who had been charged with truancy and petty theft under circumstances remarkably similar to Amara's own case 5 years earlier. Unlike Amara's first appearance, however, Destiny had an attorney who understood exactly what she was going through. "Your Honor," Amara began, "my client has been charged with chronic truancy and shoplifting food items. Before this court makes any determinations about her character or her future, I'd like to present some context about Ms. Rodriguez's circumstances." Amara opened her briefcase, leather now, professional, but containing the same kind of hope and determination that had filled her manila folder years earlier. Ms. Rodriguez has been maintaining a 3.7 GPA while caring for her 8-year-old brother and working part-time to help support her family. The truancy charges stem from days when her mother was hospitalized for complications from diabetes, and she had to stay home to care for her brother. The alleged theft was a loaf of bread and milk when the family had no food for 3 days. Judge Coleman leaned forward, and Amara could see the recognition in her eyes, not just of the similarities to Amara's own case, but of the responsibility to handle this moment with the wisdom she had gained from their previous encounter. "Ms. Rodriguez," Judge Coleman said gently, "I understand you're a junior at Washington High School. Tell me about your academic interests." Destiny looked surprised by the question, glancing nervously at Amara, who nodded encouragingly. I want to be a doctor, ma'am. I'm in advanced biology and chemistry classes." "That's impressive. Maintaining high grades in advanced sciences while dealing with family responsibilities shows remarkable dedication. What kind of medicine interests you?" Pediatrics maybe? Or family practice? I want to help families like mine who can't always afford health care. Judge Coleman nodded thoughtfully, then looked at the prosecutor. What is the state's position on these charges? The prosecutor, who had been through bias training based on Amara's research, stood respectfully. Your Honor, given the defendant's circumstances and academic record, the state would be amenable to dismissing charges contingent on Ms. Rodriguez receiving appropriate family support services. Ms. Thompson, Judge Coleman continued, what services does your client's family need to prevent similar situations in the future? Your Honor, the family would benefit from emergency food assistance, healthcare navigation support for Mrs. Rodriguez's diabetes management, and childcare resources so Destiny can maintain her academic focus. I've already been in contact with several community organizations willing to provide these services. Very well. This court hereby dismisses all charges against Ms. Rodriguez, contingent on her family receiving the support services outlined by counsel and Ms. Rodriguez checking in with the court monthly to report on her academic progress. Judge Coleman paused, looking directly at Destiny. Young lady, I want you to know that your circumstances do not define your potential. Your dedication to your education and your family shows character that will serve you well in whatever field you choose to pursue. Tears welled up in Destiny's eyes. Thank you, Your Honor. As court adjourned, Amara walked with Destiny and her mother to discuss the support services that had been arranged. Mrs. Rodriguez, a woman in her 40s who looked exhausted from the stress of poverty and illness, gripped Amara's hands. Mija, how can we ever thank you? They told us Destiny might be sent away, that her record would be ruined forever. Mrs. Rodriguez, 5 years ago I was in Destiny's exact situation. Someone believed in my potential when I couldn't even believe in it myself. Now it's my job to do the same for other kids. Later that afternoon, Amara found herself back in Judge Coleman's chambers, a familiar setting that had become the foundation of one of the most important relationships in her life. That was beautifully handled, Judge Coleman said. Watching you advocate for that young woman, seeing how you understood not just the legal issues but the human story behind them, it reminded me why you chose law in the first place. It felt like coming full circle, Amara said, but also like a beginning. There are so many destinies out there, so many kids whose potential gets buried under their circumstances. Judge Coleman smiled. Speaking of beginnings, I have something to tell you. The President has asked me to chair a National Commission on Juvenile Justice Reform. I've been authorized to select my own staff, and I can't think of anyone more qualified to serve as the Commission's research director than you. Amara felt her breath catch. Judge Coleman, I just started at the Urban Justice Institute. This would be a temporary assignment, 18 months, with the goal of drafting comprehensive recommendations for congressional action on juvenile justice reform. Your research would form the foundation of federal policy for decades to come. The magnitude of the opportunity was staggering. From homeless teenager to potential architect of national juvenile justice policy in just 5 years. I need to think about it, Amara said, and I need to discuss it with my mentors and colleagues. Of course, take the time you need. But Amara, I want you to know that everything you've accomplished has led to this moment. You have the credibility, the expertise, and most importantly, the lived experience to make recommendations that could change the trajectory of juvenile justice in America. That evening, Amara sat in the same coffee shop where she and Marcus had celebrated his law school acceptance, now planning their next steps in reforming the system that had almost failed them both. You have to take the commission position, Marcus said without hesitation. This is your chance to implement everything we've learned on a national scale. But what about our work here? The training programs, the Youth Advocacy Board, all the local reforms we're still implementing. That work will continue. But Amara, think about what you could accomplish with federal authority behind your recommendations. Think about every kid in every juvenile court in America benefiting from policies you help create. Mrs. Jackson, joining them for their weekly dinner, was equally adamant. Baby, your grandmother always said you were meant for something special. This is it. This is your chance to honor everything she believed about the power of education and determination to change the world. As they walked home through the neighborhood that had shaped her, Amara thought about the journey from that desperate morning in the courtroom to this moment of unprecedented opportunity. Every challenge had prepared her for greater responsibility, every victory had expanded her vision of what was possible. The next morning she called Judge Coleman with her decision. Your Honor, I accept the position. With the condition that the commission includes voices of young people who have been through the system, not just experts who study it from the outside. I wouldn't have it any other way, Judge Coleman said warmly. Welcome to the next phase of your mission to change the world, one court at a time. As Amara hung up the phone, she looked out her apartment window at the city that had nearly broken her but ultimately made her stronger. Somewhere out there was another homeless teenager doing homework by streetlight, another brilliant kid being underestimated by adults who couldn't see past circumstances to potential. But now, for the first time in history, there would be federal policies designed by someone who understood that struggle intimately, who had lived through the system's failures and triumphs, and who carried the voices of hundreds of young people who had found their power through her work. The scared teenager with the manila folder had become the architect of justice itself. And this was only the beginning of the legacy she would leave for every child who dared to dream beyond their circumstances and demand to be seen, heard, and valued for who they truly were.